All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. We do educational videos. We try to help our listeners out with turning them on to great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, cosmologies, also magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries from sources that you probably haven't heard of before. People who spent a big chunk of their life putting together their heart and soul, put their heart and soul into some research into what they were really passionate about, but nobody paid attention. They got no credit, they got no money, but they put out a great product. And so I'm trying to dust some of their work off, whether they're ancient or modern, and kind of guide you through these different texts, many of which are quite difficult, and to contextualize them so that you can at least see their importance and decide whether this should be something that you invest some time in, because you're going to have to invest some time in it. It's not going to, you're not going to be able to snap your fingers and get it, most likely. Well, that's the nature of, your theories of everything, or your, paradigm shifting theories. And we are on our 250th video having to do with what is called the Reciprocal Church, named after Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory, which I consider to be the most comprehensive, accurate, and game-changing theory of everything that's out there. Larson did his work starting from about 1930 until 1990. That's when he died. And I've got almost 600 videos on the reciprocal system on this channel, and 300 or so videos on the Tree of Life. And now this is video 250 on Reciprocal Church, where we're trying to piece together a working spiritual practice. We're looking at different sources that describe various practices, various approaches to get you closer to the divine, or to whatever it is that you have reverence for in your life. We're kind of doing this in response to a lot of the recent work that's been done that is pretty much debunking permanently the Western religions. I believe that all of the Western religions, meaning Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Satanism, are all about to crash out and burn, because their foundational texts were written by the Romans, the Caesars, the Roman emperors from the first century, mainly the ones in the Flavian dynasty from 69 to 96 AD. I think there's some evidence that the idea was went back as far as Emperor Tiberius, which was in, the so-called actual Jesus's lifetime. My critique of the Old Testament is separate from this and will come later. But there is certainly some evidence that the Romans wrote at least a little bit, if not all, of the Old Testament. One author, James Ballantyne Hannay, from the early 20th century at Oxford, he actually believes, and maybe there's anti-Semitism here. I'm not, I've only read one of his books, so I'm not like espousing this, but he also says that many other historians, biblical historians at Oxford, believe the same thing, that the Romans created Hebrew, and they created the entire Jewish history was a psyop by the Romans. But that's for later. For today and for these videos that we're doing now, we're looking at the New Testament, and that I'm very confident is a psyop from the Romans. The Romans wrote the New Testament in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 100s AD, and they backdated the story a generation or 40 years, and the things that Jesus predicts are going to happen, he prophesies, are actually fulfilled by the Emperor Titus in his military campaign against the Jews in the Romans' war against the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. And these were documented by Josephus in his book War of the Jews, or Jewish War. And Josephus has an interesting backstory that I've gone through a number of different times, but for the purposes here, he basically, if you read Josephus, 7 books of the Jewish War, and then his 20 or 22 books of antiquities of the Jews. He's also got an autobiography out there. I can't say that I've read all of it, but I've read probably 20 of the books total, maybe 18 of them or something. And it becomes increasingly obvious that whoever wrote Josephus, whether he is a real person and really existed, or whether he is one of the Romans, because he was living at Rome as a member of the Roman imperial family, adopted member. He had the name Flavius Josephus, named after the Flavian dynasty of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And he was basically the court historian for the Romans. And if you read him carefully, next in unison with reading the Gospels particularly, you can realize that whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the Gospels. They mirror each other. They ping pong after back and forth between each other, and that is the subject of this book here that just came out late 2024 by Michael Menescotz, Menesgotz. His book is called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. And what he does in his book is he makes a graph, which will be on the thumbnail to this video, is his filled out graph. And he puts the book of Luke on the vertical axis, 24 chapters. And he puts Wars of the Jews on the horizontal axis, 694 paragraphs. And then he goes through them and finds all the parallels between the two. And in some cases, Luke is parodying the Josephus book. In some cases, Josephus is parodying the Gospels. And he plots the points where he finds the parallels. And when he adds up all the 250 parallels he found in the book of Luke, it makes a pattern that you will see there on the thumbnail. And he's going to discuss that a little bit here. Mainly in this book, he's going in exhaustive detail through each one of the 250 parallels. So you can see, okay, a few of them are kind of weak. Many of them are very difficult to see. But even the ones that are difficult to see are laden with parallels, very, very well hidden parallels. And they're also mocking and mean-spirited, brutal, grim, and just in many cases bawdy, and in some cases downright pornographic. And but you have to kind of know the code to be able to figure out what they're talking about. Kind of the major thing that he's talked about so far, I won't say the major, but a major, at least for me, is that the pattern is generally that Jesus prophesies something, says something is going to occur, and he usually says it in a symbolic manner, like a parable or parody, and that prophecy is fulfilled by Emperor Titus, who was at that time the military general during the war. He became emperor later. Same with his father Vespasian. And so that basically adds up to Titus is the second coming of Jesus. And that adds up to, if you are a follower of Apocalypse, Revelation, and you're waiting for the second coming of Jesus, well, it happened 1,950 years ago, and it was documented in Josephus's Wars of the Jews. But really, the account of Jesus was fictional, and the whole thing about Titus is also probably not completely fictional, but probably heavily embellished. And the whole thing is just a psychological operation to mellow out the Jews, because the Jews were a big pain in the butt for the Romans. They were, for the last 150 years, they had been insurrecting and revoluting and even breaking out into periodic wars against the Romans. And Titus and Vespasian had just gotten done fighting the 7-year-long war, during which time both of them were badly injured. And, you know, they were tired of the monotheism, special chosen people, the kosher diets, the no graven images, the animal sacrifices, the circumcisions. They just were tired of the Jews not being able to assimilate into their empire. And so they proposed an assimilated character named Jesus, who they proposed as a hero, a miracle worker and savior that believed in turning the other cheek, in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldiers' backpack on their back, and believing that the Roman centurion slave owner had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and who was described as a Prince of Peace. They wanted to cultivate those ideas in Jews. And eventually, with the epistles of Paul, which actually came later instead of earlier, and the epistles of Paul were written by Pliny the Younger, another insider to the Caesars, and actually a foster brother of Arius Piso, who is kind of the background person who probably wrote a lot of this, the Gospels, and his children wrote a lot of the other books of the Bible that are not the epistles, including Revelation and Hebrews. And so Paul's epistles are really targeted toward the Gentiles, and you can kind of see that if you look at them there. But in any case, you know, Jesus hardly ever, or if ever, does anything against the Romans, but he does all kinds of stuff against the Jews. And same with Paul. Even, you know, Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen in their book, Operation Messiah, they accuse Paul of being a spy for the Romans. And I think this supersedes that theory, but the point I'm making is that that's how Paul behaves. Paul behaves like a Roman would. So anyway, we're going to get to this new section here in Menescott's book called Constructing and Deconstructing the APTVS Message. Now, the APTVS message is what is on the thumbnail, and that is what the graph that Menescott's, where he makes with the Book of Luke crossed with Josephus's Wars of the Jews, and filling it, plotting all the points, makes 5 Latin letters, APTVS. Which I think stands for Arius Piso Titus Vespasianus. He thinks something slightly different, but I really think that that's kind of a background issue. The most important thing is that there are 250 parallels in the Book of Luke between Josephus and the Book of Luke, and that those parallels, when graphed, make a signal, not a noise, but a signal. And that noise is the signature of the authors. Okay, my own research on this topic began in 2019. And again, this book is from 2024. Okay, my own research on this topic began in 2019 as a result of reading Joseph Atwill's groundbreaking book, Caesar's Messiah. I had imagined that his book would be a hand-waving argument that the only sensible explanation for the anonymous accounts of Jesus' message to pay taxes to Rome and to turn the other cheek and tolerate oppression was that there were clever propaganda originating from Rome, or that these were clever propaganda originating from Rome. How wrong I was. What Atwill showed was a sequence of parallels between the Gospels and War of the Jews. And in response to criticism, he issued a second version describing a larger set of parallels, which include the majority of the ones listed so far in this book. Now, his second edition is just called Caesar's Messiah, the Flavian Signature, and that came out in 2010. And he just beefs up, like he doubles down. In the first book, he shows about 40 parallels, and in this book, he shows about, 75 or something. But Menescott's found 250 just in the Book of Luke. Just think, as you're reading through your Bible, that's like 15 per page or something like that. Okay, and some of them are undeniable. Some of them are totally obvious, and some of them, when pointed out to you, are also undeniable. We've gone through many of those, and we will continue to do that, hopefully even today. He commented that there were more to find, and I certainly found this to be true, with the result that I have expanded that sequence even further. And also, in Atwill, the parallels occur in order. Okay, so like as we move through the narrative of Luke, we move through the narrative of Wars of the Jews, and the parallels are in order in both books. And they also occur at the same locations. So when Jesus is going to a certain place, say the Sea of Galilee, what he prophesies at the Sea of Galilee is fulfilled by Titus at the Sea of Galilee 40 years later. Coincidence? I've been reading because I want to make sure that I have my argument together. So I've been reading The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. And, this is the, basically cheerleading book for, just the somewhat academic approach to looking at the Gospels and why we should be believing these, or the whole New Testament. And it's like every argument that he makes in there is like he visits a number of scholars around the country, and he's a journalist. He visits a number of, he was like a court reporter, so that's why it's the case for Christ, because it's like a bunch of, it's like kind of a legal approach to it. And it's like every argument that the various people make to support the Jesus story, in, you know, like he'll say, oh, the critics say this, and then they make an argument to, you know, affirm the story that's in the Bible. Their arguments completely, they make an argument for Christianity, but they make, or for the Bible, but they make an even stronger argument for the Roman origin of it. You know, it's pretty funny. Because none of them know about this, or at least they pretend like they don't. And even though this theory has been around for 150 years, and it goes all the way back. I mean, William Shakespeare knew this, but William Shakespeare was a woman. And that's revealed in Atwill's second book called Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. So people have known this throughout history. The people who put together the Talmud knew about it. But it's very interesting that the case for Christ actually bolsters the case for Caesar even more than it bolsters the case for Christ. And, you know, the general idea that they talk about is, well, you don't resort to supernatural occurrences until there are no natural alternatives. And I agree completely. You know, it's like when you propose that the Romans wrote it, then you're saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. You know, but a conspiracy theory is more likely than a supernatural occurrence. You know, that's what they're not understanding about Occam's razor, is you don't resort to supernatural occurrences if there are natural occurrences that would explain it in the same way or better. And that's what we have here. We have a bunch of people using supernatural occurrences to explain something because they don't think there's a rational explanation for it. But there is. It might be a conspiracy, but it actually is a conspiracy coming from the exact people that you would expect a conspiracy to come from. And the people that had the motive, the method, the means, the opportunity to pull it off. In fact, they had a complete monopoly over anything that was written in the first century. So, you know, a monopoly and censorship power over anything that was written in the first century. So anyway, whilst expanding that sequence is valuable and necessary, my 4-year effort to find all the noteworthy parallels to the realization that there are additional huge sequences of well-hidden yet detailed parallels which are quite distinct from the ones Joseph Atwill mainly described. Most of Atwill's parallels are, like he says, the way Jesus primarily parodies Titus. But then there are a lot of them that go in the other direction too, which, you know, makes it clear to me that they're both written at the same time by the same people. Joseph Atwill seemed almost equally content to reference any of the 4 Gospels, and maybe this is why the book did not offer a chart comparing the locations of the parallels versus any one specific gospel. However, he did make the point that in some places the parallels in Luke and Jewish war appear in the same order. And what initially piqued my curiosity was to know whether perhaps all of them were in much the same order. Okay, this section is called Effort to Catalog the Parallels. Of course, my initial efforts resulted only in determining that there was a semblance of a pattern, but nothing conclusive. Especially in Luke, there is a sort of line, but it isn't straight, and there are others that don't adhere to the line. My curiosity deepened, and that began my effort to determine whether, if more parallels were located and added, perhaps the line would become clearer. I spent months poring over the documents, steadily adding dots to the chart, and it only became more vexing. There were dots all over the chart, yet clearly not at random. I started forming hypotheses to test them. I devoted a fair portion of 2021 to the hypothesis that it was an image of a branch, since the concept of Christianity as a branch of Judaism at face value was a theme that cropped up numerous times. And that is definitely a theme that many of these parallels do. Atwill identifies it as the new root and branch, and that this is a process of pruning or domesticating the wild Judaism with the domesticated Jesus and the domesticated form of Christianity, which is much easier to assimilate. I also explored the hypothesis that the diagonal line was one half of a giant V spanning the entire chart, V for Vespasian. And it was whilst evaluating this theory, I discovered about 2/3 of what would later turn out to be the right-hand side of the APTVS. So the A is way over at the very beginning of Wars of the Jews. So the first 100 or 150 paragraphs of Wars of the Jews. I was amazed to discover such a straight, narrow line there, and it gave me renewed confidence that I was uncovering a pattern that might be intended to be plotted on a chart. Yet its location and angle didn't fit well with a single V shape. I thought perhaps a U shape was a better fit, and therefore it might be an anchor symbol, which was a key symbol for early Christians, which really preceded both the fish, or it did have a kind of a dolphin in it, and the fish and the cross, which came later. The anchor hypothesis kept me going a while longer, not least because it led me to find some parallels right in the middle, forming a vertical line. But ultimately, I had to conclude that this hypothesis, too, was false. What I was just saying about the anchor and the cross and the fish, that stuff is discussed a lot in the book called, I believe it's called Creating Christ, James Valiant. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the other guy, but James Valiant is the author of that. So I'm not saying that as an authority. I'm just citing another author. That could be right or it could be wrong. I persevered for another year. I tried running fuzzy logic text searches to identify passages with similar words, this being just before the advent of generative AI, which wasted a lot of time and only led to a single parallel being uncovered. Frustrated, I went back to manually comparing the documents, evening after evening. But very slowly, more lines were coming into focus. It was only after I realized that I was looking at a sequence of at least 4 Latin letters that my progress accelerated, as, for the first time, my working hypothesis was pointing me to look in the right locations. Okay, that's the end of that page. I'm going to go through the rigmarole here of flipping the page, which is no picnic. Okay, now this section is called the turning point. I could see that based on the space available, the first letter might be an A, followed by one or two unknown letters, a T or an I, and then maybe a V, and then just possibly an S. Aware of the existing work pointing to the name Arius Piso, and that work is from both independently Abelard Reuchlin and Roman Piso, who claims to be a relative, a descendant of Arius Piso. They both independently arrived at Arius Piso as the author of the Gospels. Reuchlin's work is from 1979. It's just like a pamphlet or a booklet. It's not. You can find it on the internet, but before the internet, you would have been lucky to get your hands on it. But it's very, very interesting, and it's very, very devastating because it wipes out. It doesn't just wipe out, the New Testament. It wipes out a lot of other stuff too. I mean, if he's right. And his methods are really going over a lot of the old letters between Titus, Vespasian, Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cicero, and all of them had a ton of different aliases and pseudonyms, and you have to read it in the original language, and you have to really understand both Latin and Greek at least, if not Hebrew as well, and you just have to kind of like chart it out and figure out. You can deduce who is who. It's like a shell game. And you can deduce who is who, but it just is very painstaking and it takes a long time. He did it and showed his work. I'm going to try to confirm it as we move on. Okay, so aware of the existing work pointing to the name Arius Piso, my best guess at one point in time was Arius, A-R-I-U-S, which was close enough to prove useful. However, it was discovering the top right of the T that was a turning point. The entire group of parallels in that region formed a coherent parody, but instead of Luke parodying Jewish war was clearly parodying Luke. Okay, we'll stop right there. This is an interesting, I think I would have liked to have this at the very beginning, but I'm quibbling, over this, I think, monumental work. So thanks for tuning in today.